And I want to address those here because the other aspect of Paul's apostleship that he highlights is its universality. Notice what Paul says here. To the Jews, I became like a Jew in order to win the Jews. But to those outside the law, I became as one outside the law. In other words, to the Gentiles, I became as a Gentile. Why does he do this? Why does he adapt to the people to whom he's preaching the gospel? It's real simple. I became all things to all men so that I might by all means save some. Okay, so what's Paul talking about here? Here Paul is describing his method of evangelization, his method of preaching the gospel as both universal and, we might say, enculturated. Okay, that's a modern term, but it's an accurate one for what Paul's doing. In other words, Paul is going to bring the good news to anyone who will listen. His mission is both to Jews and to Gentiles. And this is really important. Sometimes people think of Paul as just the apostle to the Gentiles because that's how he describes himself on various occasions. But when Paul calls himself the apostle to the Gentiles, he doesn't mean that he's not also bringing the good news to his brother and sister Jews, to his fellow Israelites. In fact, if you look at the Acts of the Apostles, if you start in chapter 8 with the conversion of Paul and you go all the way through to chapter 28, every time Paul goes to a new city to preach the good news, he always goes first to the synagogue, preaches to his fellow Jews, and then only once he's been rejected by some or all of the people in the synagogue does he then turn and bring the gospel to the pagans. So at the beginning of Romans, Paul says the gospel is to the Jew first and then to the Greek. Romans 16 through 17. So too, Paul's describing his evangelism now in 1 Corinthians 9. To the Jews I became as a Jew, to the Gentiles I became as a Gentile, so that I might by all means save some of them. Now this is going to come up later in the letter to the Corinthians when Paul deals with the question of eating food sacrificed to pagan idols or not. But for now, I just want you to see the universality of his mission and also the idea of enculturating it. In other words, Paul is going to adapt the way he preaches the gospel to whether his audience is Jewish or whether his audience is pagan. He's going to adapt the message so that he delivers it in the best way possible for a Jewish audience to hear it and for a Gentile audience to hear it. And you can actually see this if you look at his different letters. You can't prove this, but I can't help but notice that there is evidence in Paul's letter to the Romans, for example, that there was a large Jewish population in Rome, a large Jewish Christian population in Rome. Priscilla and Aquila are two of the examples of Jewish Christian believers who came from Rome, who were friends with Paul, to whom Paul is writing a letter to the Romans. Whereas when you look at the church at Corinth, it appears to be predominantly, if not exclusively, of Gentiles. Well, when you read the letter to the Corinthians, I mean, it's complicated, but it's because it's Paul. But it's really straightforward and easy to understand. But when you read Paul's letter to the Romans, and you look at the kind of fancy rhetorical moves that he's making, the kind of arguments from Scripture that he's using, the rabbinic methods of scriptural interpretation and argumentation that Paul's using, one of the reasons Romans is so complicated is because he seems to be writing it with a Jewish readership as well as a Gentile readership in mind. In other words, he's not just writing for recently converted pagans like he's doing here in Corinthians, but he's writing for any Jewish or Jewish Christian readers who might get their hands on the text. So the point is, Paul adapts the gospel to the audience to whom he is preaching it. And the reason he does that is real simple. It's not to be two-faced. It's not to soften or water down the gospel. It's for the sake of salvation. I've become all things to all people, that I might by all means save some.